Hi, everybody. Somebody left their Al Jazeera earring here at the front. If anybody has a missing Al Jazeera icon, it'll go to the neatest correct entry. I just wanted to start out with a shout out to Fran and to the Master Blaster Des and all the other organisers. I think we should give them a round of applause for this. Yeah. I wanted to pick up on a theme that actually emerged for me very interestingly in the noon session as a consequence of some things that Victoria Britton and Seamus Milne said about gender, and as a consequence also of the performance of gender by Peter Oborne. Because it seems to me that one of the things that we might want to think about in reframing this debate is actually gender issues. Victoria Britton spoke very movingly about trying to get people to think about what some people call the American War in Vietnam in the context of the impact on women rather than in a kind of degendered way, and thinking not just in terms of strategy and tactics militarily or foreign policy in general, but rather the impact on families and in particular women's bodies and children's bodies. And she and Seamus both pointed out the importance of the ideology of saving women from a beast, right, or from primitivism, that's been a crucial part of imperialism for well over a century. 150 years ago, it's part of the foundational ethos of the British Empire. 400 or 500 years ago, it's part of the foundational ethos of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. You get it again and again in the French and Belgian empires. It is the civilizing mission that will deliver a certain kind of values for women that do not apply under other social circumstances, right? We had that again and again, and it was mentioned over the last almost millennia, and it was mentioned very effectively with reference to Afghanistan today. And obviously Peter embodied a certain kind of not very liberal interventionist masculinity in the way in which he actually comported himself. So I wanted to think about some of these questions with reference to the conflicts that are considering us, or that we are considering today. And I want to start out by saying that what we've seen, I've been living the last 20 years in the United States, 11 years in New York, 8 in Los Angeles. For what it was worth, I was present on September the 11th, 2001. I saw the bodies leaping from the towers in front of me in my neighborhood. And one of the things that strikes me very powerfully about the way in which much of the nature of presidential struggles, electoral struggles, and foreign policy struggles from a US perspective has been conducted over the last decade in particular is a mixture of a weak presidency seeking to reassert an imperial presidency. Let me explain what I mean by that. As I'm sure you're aware, on a bipartisan basis across both the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States, there's been a project over the last, let's say, to be very precise, 37 and a half years, to reassert the imperial presidency over administrative law. Because you get a sudden emergence and therefore the residence of administrative law in the context of the Watergate scandal, the resignation of Richard M. Nixon as President of the United States, and the notion that you have to have a new means whereby the citizenry can have access to the center of power through the courts and not just through the conventional political process. And in fact, if you look at the redress that the working class and minorities have achieved in the US over the last 4 decades, it's principally through the courts. It's not through the conventional so-called democratic political process. As a consequence of what was lost to the imperial presidency, with the rise of administrative law post-Watergate, you get this bipartisan desire to restore the imperial presidency. Now, that notion of an imperial presidency is twofold. One aspect of it is domestic, and that's the most important part. How can we reassert the primacy of the Oval Office in struggles with other aspects of United States government, with the Supreme Court, with the Congress, with, of course, the states as well. But there's also significance in the more generally understood sense of imperialism and the imperial presidency, i.e. the impact on foreign policy of the domestic weakness of the United States president. And we see that very powerfully with, again, this bipartisan reassertion of a very macho but allegedly liberal interventionist model of policy. So my argument would be that if we look at the recently conducted general election in the United States, you're actually seeing two very domestically weak candidates. Neither of them would have had a majority in terms of the operation of the Congress. Neither of them would have had a majority in terms of the operation of a Supreme Court. And the winner, President-elect Obama, 44th president, will not have either of those things. So where are the areas in which he has maneuver? Theoretically, constitutionally, of course, that is in the area of foreign policy. But even there, the presidency has a certain limitation. So at one level, those of us living in the United States, any other US citizens here? Right? At some level, we are constantly told, you get this in the bourgeois media in the US and I guess elsewhere also, that the President of the United States is, quote unquote, the most powerful man in the world, right? We hear this, I would say, on a daily basis in the United States media. I don't know how often elsewhere. In fact, that person, whilst having massive influence over the lives of many around the world, frequently, I suspect, sees himself as being quite powerless. And there's something similar with the story of white, straight, frequently rural men in the immediately past presidential election to which I referred. I'm sure you've already seen the results of the exit polls and other kinds of public opinion survey conducted over the last really 20 years since Bill Clinton stood as the multicultural candidate. Namely, it is men like me, straightish, whitish American men, who vote for Republicans, and not many other people do. Most women don't, African Americans don't, nowadays Asian Americans don't, Latinos don't. It's a massive vote in favor of people who look like, but don't sound like, me. Where does that come from? I'm trying to draw a connection here between what I see as the comparative weakness of the imperial presidency and the comparative weakness of the straight white man in US society and culture and economy. At one level, of course, we can all agree there's a hegemonic masculinity and it's exercised by these very kinds of men. At another level, they're the people whose jobs were the first to go in the global recession, as it was felt in the United States. There's some of the people whose jobs are the last to come back as the recession supposedly ends. They feel underdone intellectually by difference. You're now seeing, for example, amongst many groups, higher levels of educational attainment being attained by women. You're seeing amongst many groups a resentment on the part of those in smaller rural electorates towards those who are living an urban life. Many of these white men think that a sort of birthright of power that was theirs is being compromised. And whilst a lot of us here might laugh at that or scoff at that concept, I think it's worth trying to engage it and do something about it. That there's something about white men being numerous and animated and fearful and angry that needs to be engaged. And I'm interested in how that could be engaged, and that turns me to the contemporary sex scandal in the United States. Now, of course, they're going on every day, and as Rutger Hauer says in Blade Runner, I have done questionable things, and I myself may have been involved in sex scandals, who knows? But the ones I'm thinking about are those involving Dr. David Petraeus and General John Allen. At one level, one can see them wall-to-wall, monumental US media coverage of these men's supposed sexual escapades as trivial, as absurd, as drawing attention away from what many of us, myself included, might regard as their war crimes. And indeed, I have sympathy with and understand that perspective. At another level, I think that in terms of trying to reframe the debate, there may be value in trying to take some of this scandal and turning it into a hinge. Do frames have hinges? I guess paintings have frames, and if they're hanging on walls, they have hinges. This metaphor may not work too well, but you know what I'm trying to get at, I think. When David Petraeus was a graduate student at Princeton University, all paid for by taxpayers, of course, along the way towards his PhD in military history, he wrote an essay that he talks about a lot and boasts about, that got him an A in grad school. This essay was entitled, "The Invasion of Grenada, Illegal, Immoral, and the Right Thing to Do." He's very proud of this fact. He's very proud of the fact that the professor at Princeton who gave him an A was someone whom he described as well to the left of him. What do we make of that? What do we make of the current alleged disgrace that he is going through in his post-military career and what is now his post-CIA career? What do we make of the investigation of General John Allen? I guess what I'm suggesting is that, to go back to the point I made a minute ago, and this is where I'll finish, but I'm still looking for a claimant to the Al Jazeera earring, is this. These are not actually trivial matters. They get to the heart of a particular model of martial masculinity, a particular notion of a moral code that these people run by. It's antithetical to everything I live by. I do not regard it as legitimate in terms of principles. But it is very similar, it's homologous to the way in which the United States administration operates, at least at the overt level, and the way in which the conventional media in the United States operate. Namely, and it's very similar also to what you get with ideas about, say, a James Bond figure in espionage, or big time what you get in the idea of the moral code of the noir detective, such as you read about in Raymond Chandler or Dashiell Hammett. Namely, I have inside me a correct code about how to comport myself interpersonally. And that code is what allows me to do any manner of other things, provided that I'm in accord with that code. So one of the things that I think in trying to reframe the coverage of the terrorism and the war waged by these men, waged by Obama, waged by Clinton, waged by the Bushes, waged by General John Allen, waged by Dr. David Petraeus, is to try to get inside and not just make fun of that particular notion of masculinity that pervades and informs much of what they do. And it's not just about power, it's also about perceived weakness. And it's the weakness of the imperial presidency, both domestically and internationally, and it's the weakness, regardless of whether it's Barack Obama or anybody else, of the white man at the core of American public life. Thank you.